Didn't even think this guy killed his wife. I mean, that like, murder is on something on the top of my mind when I call one of my friends for 3 or 4 hours and she doesn't answer the phone. Like, that doesn't even process to me as like a real thing that is a possibility.
There are crimes that pass quietly into the archives of history, sealed in boxes, filed in dusty courtrooms, forgotten by all but the families who carry the scars. And then, there are crimes that refuse to die. They linger in the air, they infect our conversations, they seep into documentaries, YouTube videos, podcasts, and late-night whispers between strangers who never knew the victims. The Watts family murders belong to that second category. August of 2018. Frederick, Colorado. A town that once carried the quiet hum of suburbia. But since that month, its name has been etched into the global consciousness as the site of one of the most haunting family tragedies of our time. This was no ordinary crime. A father stood accused of annihilating his entire family, his pregnant wife, and 2 little girls who once laughed in backyard sprinklers and posed for social media videos. The brutality was shocking, but it wasn't only the violence that made this story unforgettable. It was the betrayal. A betrayal so complete, so intimate, that the world recoiled in horror. In the courtroom, justice moved swiftly. Life sentences without parole. No trial, no appeals dragging on for decades. But while the law closed the case, society did not. Instead, the Watts case exploded beyond the boundaries of Frederick, beyond Colorado, beyond the United States. It became a global obsession, a mirror, a wound. Why? Why this case, when there are thousands of family tragedies every year? Why do millions still replay Shanann's videos, hearing her voice echo from the grave? Why do strangers still scour interrogation footage, searching for flickers of truth in a man's nervous smile? Why does this case still haunt us, nearly a decade later? Perhaps because it strikes at something primal. We are taught to believe that home is the one place where love endures, where children are safe, where partners stand together against the world. When that sanctuary is shattered not by an intruder, not by a stranger, but by the person sworn to protect it, the horror is immeasurable. This was not a faceless crime. It was not shadowed in mystery or unsolved in ambiguity. It was the very opposite, a family we could see, in vivid color, every day. Shanann, what's made sure of that? Her Facebook page was a stage where her daughters danced, where smiles seemed endless, where health struggles were transformed into inspiration, and where her love for her husband was broadcast to all. And then, it all fell apart. In a courtroom in Greeley, Colorado, the silence was deafening. A pregnant mother and 2 small children were gone. A man in a prison jumpsuit sat behind a table, his life stripped down to shackles and shame. And yet, even in that silence, the questions did not stop. They multiplied. They spread. Why did he do it? What darkness festers in a man who can look into his children's eyes one moment and extinguish their lives the next? What happened behind the closed doors of that suburban home? Doors that cameras never captured. And why? Why, above all, does this case still cut so deep, years after the gavel fell? The answer is not simple. It lies in the fractures of a marriage, in the war between appearances and reality, in the financial despair that erodes trust, in the health struggles that drain energy, in the tensions between families that never heal. But it also lies in us. In a digital age where we watch other people's lives unfold on screens, we saw the Watts family as neighbors, as friends, as reflections of our own attempts to hold everything together. We saw our own fragility in theirs. That is why this story refuses to die, because it is not just the story of Chris and Shanann. It is the story of love corroded by lies, of a family destroyed by silence, of appearances that mask despair. It is the story of every unspoken fear that lives behind suburban doors, every crack that spreads beneath a smiling photo. And as the world watched the Watts case unfold, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This was not just about a man who killed his family. It was about the hidden fractures that can live inside any family. It was about us. What follows is not the simple retelling of a crime. We know the dates, the charges, the sentences. What remains are the shadows. This is not the story of a single night. This is the story of the cracks that formed long before, the betrayals that multiplied, the secrets that metastasized. It is the story of how appearances deceived, how digital lives outlived flesh, and how the haunting echoes of one family's collapse became a mirror for millions. This is the case that refuses to die. In the world of Facebook Reels and YouTube uploads, the Watts family looked like a dream preserved in pixels. Smiling daughters danced in summer dresses, a mother laughed through her exhaustion, a husband posed with a quiet grin. To friends and strangers scrolling by, it was the image of stability, of happiness, of everything a young family was supposed to be. But digital portraits lie. They are edited, rehearsed, performed. And for Sean Watts, social media was not only self-expression, it was survival. It was a way to prove to herself and to the world that the chaos behind closed doors could be managed, that love could be curated, that sickness and debt and loneliness could be concealed under the soft glow of filters and likes. Every clip of her daughters laughing was a prayer that their lives would look as whole as she longed for them to be. Every video testimonial about her work or her marriage was a shield against the truth she felt slipping through her fingers. In a world where validation is currency, Sean fought to keep her family alive with smiles broadcast to strangers. And yet, inside the same walls, something entirely different grew. Chris became quieter, his eyes duller. His phone was always near him, his smile less frequent. The daughters noticed absences their young minds could not explain. Friends saw subtle changes. Texts unanswered, conversations shorter, tension that hummed below the surface. To the outside world, the Watts family was enviable. To those closest, something was wrong. But no one could measure just how deep the cracks went. The tragedy of this chapter is not only what would come later, but what it reveals about us. About the world we live in now, where families measure their worth by the perfection they display, where pain is hidden behind endless performance. Sean believed in her digital stage because it was the only stage left to her. And millions of us believed it too. That is why the betrayal to come shattered so completely. The public felt robbed of the illusion they had been complicit in consuming. Strangers wept for children they never met, for a mother they only knew through her phone camera, because through Shanann's lens, they had been invited into her home. And when that home was destroyed, the audience felt the collapse as if it were their own. A family on display, a family adored, a family already unraveling behind the curtain. This was not the story Sean thought she was telling, but it is the story the world will never forget. Behind every perfect photograph was a ledger of debts, arguments, and unspoken fears. The Watts home, neat and ordinary from the outside, carried the weight of financial collapse within its walls. Bankruptcy papers still whispered from years past. Credit card balances climbed. Mortgage payments slipped. For Sean, every dollar was stretched, every plan a fragile balance between survival and appearances. Money has a way of corroding intimacy. It creeps into conversations, sharpens small disagreements, and turns partners into adversaries. Sean, battling chronic illness, tried to mask the stress with determination. She pushed her home business brand online, projecting confidence, hope, and control. But at night, in the quiet, she wrote in her diary of fear. fear of losing her husband, fear of being left alone with children who depended on her strength. And Chris, silent, passive, agreeable on the surface, grew colder. His withdrawal was not sudden. It was gradual, like a slow leak draining the air from a room. Text messages tell the story more clearly than smiles ever could. Shannon pleading for connection. Chris responding with silence, short replies, half-hearted promises. Words that landed like stones. The fractures extended beyond the couple. Shannon's battle with her mother-in-law, Cindy Watts, became a war with no truce. Arguments about diet, about children, about respect cut deep. Shannon felt judged, unwelcome, dismissed. Family gatherings became minefields. Chris, ever reluctant to confront, stood between two worlds, and in trying to please both, he abandoned both. The conflict left Shannon feeling stranded, her marriage a battlefield where she fought alone. Friends recall her exhaustion. They remember the way her voice cracked when she spoke of her marriage, how she confided in whispers that she was trying to hold everything together for her girls. They saw the effort it took for her to keep smiling online while privately fearing her husband's love was slipping away. It is easy, after the fact, to treat these cracks as foreshadowing. But in the moment, they were the kind of cracks every family knows. The bills that pile up, the coldness of in-laws, the silences between partners. What made them fatal here was the way they converged. Illness, money, family conflict, emotional distance, each one a wound. Together, they bled the marriage dry. And still, Shannon fought. She wrote. She begged. She tried to reason. She carried the invisible labor of saving a relationship that Chris no longer wished to save. Her texts were filled with devotion and desperation, each one a plea for connection. His were filled with detachment, each one a reminder that her fight was a lonely one. Behind the curated smile of family life was a woman breaking under the weight of unspoken battles. And behind his quiet nods and easy shrugs was a man drifting further into silence. The cracks beneath the smile were widening, and soon they would split the family apart forever. There comes a moment in some lives when the mask no longer feels heavy, when deceit becomes easier than truth. For Chris Watts, that moment arrived in 2018. He reinvented himself piece by piece. Weight melted off his frame, muscles grew, new clothes appeared in his wardrobe. Friends noticed. Even Shannon, clinging to the last threads of hope, saw the change and wrote in her diary that her husband seemed distant, distracted, unreachable. What she could not see was the other life forming in the shadows. It began at work, in the ordinary routine of an oilfield job. Nichol Kessinger, young, sharp, independent, entered his orbit. She asked questions. He answered. Conversations grew. Soon there were secret texts, hidden calls, whispers made possible by apps designed for concealment. And with each message, Chris shed another piece of his old identity. Criminologists call it the double life. A psychological fracture where one self remains the dutiful husband and father, while another emerges in secret, breathing in forbidden air. For Chris, it was not just lust or novelty. It was rebirth. With Nichol, he could pretend he was free of debt, of arguments, of family obligations, of illness and tension. He could imagine himself as a man starting over. But double lives demand silence. They feed on lies. Every smile to Shannon was a betrayal. Every hug to his daughters carried the weight of deceit. His phone, once an accessory, became a lifeline to his other world. And in the stolen glow of those messages, he grew addicted. Addicted to the feeling of being wanted, admired, desired, not as a father with responsibilities, but as a man unburdened. Shannon felt it. In her final weeks, she wrote of a husband who no longer touched her, no longer spoke to her, no longer looked her in the eye. She begged him to tell her what was wrong, begged him to fight for their marriage. He stayed silent, even as he texted another woman late into the night. The heartbreak of betrayal is not only in the act, but in the cruel performance of normalcy. Chris kissed his daughters goodnight while dreaming of a life without them. He posed for family photographs while planning getaways with someone else. He promised Shannon forever while carving out a future where she did not exist. And Nichol, whether knowingly or unknowingly, became the accelerant. She has said she believed Chris was separated, even divorcing. But she also admitted later that their relationship might have accelerated the process. Her presence became the mirror Chris gazed into, not to see who he was, but to see who he wanted to be. For Shannon, every unanswered text, every cold shoulder, every unexplained absence was another wound. She was fighting for a family already slipping through her hands, not realizing another woman's shadow was pulling it away. This was the hidden double life, and it would end in devastation. Every family carries private struggles, but some are heavier than others. For Shannon Watts, the battles she faced were not only physical, but emotional, spiritual, and invisible. Lupus carved its toll into her body, draining her energy, demanding strict medications, making every pregnancy more dangerous than the last. Yet she pushed forward, determined to give her children stability, to give her marriage hope, to give her life meaning. Her pregnancies were not simply celebrations, they were acts of courage. Each one carried risk, each one tested her body and her strength. Yet in her videos, she smiled brightly, placing her hand on her belly, speaking of love and joy. What those clips never revealed was the fear that lived beneath. The fear that her husband was slipping away. The fear that her illness made her too much of a burden. The fear that she was fighting alone. Control became her lifeline. She managed the household schedules, the finances, the children's diets, the medications, the small details of family life that Chris often ignored. But control was not dominance. It was desperation. It was the effort of a woman trying to keep a crumbling foundation from collapsing. Behind her assertiveness was terror, that without her, everything would fall apart. Friends remember her vulnerability in private moments. They recall her tears when Chris pulled away, the way her voice cracked when she asked if they thought he still loved her. They remember the weight she carried, not only of illness and motherhood, but of holding up a marriage that seemed to be disintegrating by the day. And yet, she never stopped trying. She wrote him letters, pleading for connection. She planned couples getaways, hoping to reignite what once was. She told him in texts that she felt abandoned, that she was scared, that she still loved him. In return, he gave silence, half answers, detachment. The gulf between them widened, but she kept building bridges across it, even as they collapsed beneath her feet. This was Shannon's unspoken battle, fighting to preserve a family when the man beside her had already chosen to walk away. Fighting to appear strong for her daughters when her body ached from disease and her heart ached from neglect. Fighting to convince herself that love could still survive when every sign told her it was dying. Her resilience was extraordinary, but resilience has limits. And in those final weeks, she began to sense the truth she could not name. Her husband was not only distant, he was gone in spirit, tethered to another world, another woman, another life. She was carrying a child, carrying her daughters, carrying the crushing weight of illness and finances, and carrying the unbearable burden of a marriage already lost. The heartbreak is not only in how her life ended, but in how she lived, exhausted, determined, clinging to love with hands that were already bleeding. Shannon's story is not only one of death, but of the endless battles she fought while still alive. battles no camera captured, battles that leave us shattered in their silence. When the bodies were found, the world gasped. But the deeper haunting lies not in the crime itself, but in the theater of confession that followed. What unfolded inside interrogation rooms, through body cam footage and police reports, was not clarity. It was devastation dressed as half-truths. On the day his family was reported missing, Chris Watts played the role of the worried husband. He paced, he wrung his hands, he smiled at officers in ways that made their stomachs turn. The cameras caught everything: the strange calm, the rehearsed concern, the deadness behind his eyes. To the trained investigator, it was a performance unraveling. To the public, later watching the footage, it was unbearable. The realization that a man could feign innocence with such casual ease. But the most haunting moment came not with the police, but with his father. In that stark interrogation room, as the walls closed in, Chris asked for his dad. Ronnie Watts sat beside him. A father's presence meant to provide comfort. What he received instead was an unspeakable confession. Chris bent low, his voice trembling, and whispered words that shattered his father's heart. That Shannon had killed the girls, and that he, in turn, had killed her. It was a lie, a desperate, cruel manipulation to soften his own fall, to stain Shannon even in death. His father's silence was deafening. A father caught between the instinct to protect his son and the horror of hearing him admit to violence. That silence has never left the case. It lingers like a ghost, a parent absorbing the unthinkable, unable to reconcile the boy he raised with the man before him. The interrogation continued. Polygraphs failed. Lies crumbled. Eventually, Chris confessed to killing Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. But even that confession came stripped of honesty. He told fragments, distortions, rehearsed narratives that shifted blame, minimized intent, painted himself as overwhelmed. He fed investigators just enough truth to close the case, but not enough to reveal the depth of his darkness. The world watched, and the world wept, not only for Shannon and her children, but for the ease with which truth was twisted in that small room, for the way Chris could exploit even his father's love as a shield, for the way silence, manipulation, and half-answers could stand in the place of full justice. The interrogation tapes remain some of the most haunting evidence of the case, not because they solved the crime, but because they exposed the abyss in human nature. How far someone will go to rewrite reality, how coldly they can sit in a chair and erase their family with words as casual as lies. Beyond the crime scene, beyond the shallow grave, the real horror was in that room, in the confession that wasn't truth, in the silence that broke a father, in the manipulation that leaves us all questioning whether we ever truly knew the man at all. In the courtroom, silence often speaks louder than words. It was in that silence that two families sat staring across an abyss that could never be bridged. On one side, Shannon's parents, Frank and Sandy Rzusek, their faces carved with grief, their bodies carrying the unbearable weight of burying a daughter and grandchildren. On the other side, Ronnie and Cindy Watts, parents too, but parents of the man who had destroyed it all. Two sets of parents, both victims in different ways, both bound together by a tragedy that annihilated everything they once held sacred. The Rzuseks came to court to speak for the dead. They carried Shannon's voice, Bella's laughter, Celeste's sparkle, and the unborn promise of baby Nico. They stood for justice, demanding that the memory of their daughter and grandchildren be preserved in dignity. Their pain was raw, exposed, and unrelenting. Every tear shed was a testimony of love violated, of innocence destroyed. Across from them, the Watts family faced their own torment. Ronnie and Cindy loved their son. They remembered him as a quiet boy, a child who once hugged them, a man they believed incapable of such monstrosity. Yet here he sat, shackled, condemned, the evidence undeniable. Their grief was different, but no less real. They had lost their granddaughters too, but their loss was compounded by shame, the unbearable knowledge that their own flesh and blood was responsible. Courtroom glances became daggers. The Rzuseks saw in Cindy's words a refusal to acknowledge Shanann's goodness, an insistence on painting her as controlling, difficult, even toxic. To them, it felt like a second murder, the killing of Shanann's character in death. The Watts, meanwhile, believed their son had been suffocated under pressure, a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Two families, both grieving, both blinded by their own truth, collided in the most public of ways. Letters were written but never sent. Words were spoken under breath, sometimes cruel, sometimes defensive. The trial was supposed to be about justice, but in reality, it was also a war of grief, a war without victors. The world often forgets that crime destroys more than the immediate victims. It rips through entire bloodlines, tearing parents from children, grandparents from grandchildren, families from each other. For the Rzuseks, holidays became unbearable reminders of empty chairs. For the Watts, every family gathering became a shadow of shame, the ghost of a son alive but forever gone. The image of both families sitting in that courtroom remains one of the most heartbreaking symbols of the case. The Rzuseks clutching tissues, fighting to breathe through sobs. The Watts staring at the ground, silent, broken, unable to reconcile the boy they raised with the man condemned before them. No reconciliation was possible. No peace was offered. The courtroom was not only the site of sentencing, but of permanent rupture. A family divided, not by disagreement, but by devastation so complete that the very idea of forgiveness seemed impossible. And in that room, beneath the weight of grief and silence, the truth settled like dust. No family survives murder intact. Long after the verdict was read and the prison doors clanged shut, the Watts case refused to fade. Instead, it grew louder, spreading like wildfire through living rooms, phones, and laptops around the world. For the first time, a family annihilation was not just reported, it was consumed, dissected, replayed endlessly by millions who felt as though they had been part of the story all along. Strangers scrolled through Shanann's Facebook videos as though they were sacred relics. Each smile, each gentle scolding of her girls, each affectionate word to Chris became evidence in a trial of public opinion. People cried watching Bella sing a song about her father being a hero, knowing the terrible fate that awaited her. They replayed Shanann's pregnancy reveal, her hope shining as she handed Chris a tiny t-shirt that said, "Oops, we did it again." To watch these moments after the murders was to feel an unbearable weight. Joy transformed into prophecy, love into tragedy. But grief was only part of the public reaction. Online forums filled with theories, accusations, endless debates. And at the center of many of them stood one name, Nichol Kessinger. Was she simply the mistress who stepped into the cracks of a failing marriage, or was she something more? Did she encourage? Did she plan? Did she know? The world demanded answers the courts never gave. For the Rzuseks, the exposure was both comfort and torment. Comfort, because strangers around the world carried their daughter's memory, refusing to let her name be forgotten. Torment, because every intimate video Shanann once shared was now dissected by strangers, judged by voices who had never met her. The internet preserved her life, but in preserving it, it consumed her. The Watts family faced a different pain. Their son became a monster in the eyes of the world. Every photograph of Chris, every home video of him with his daughters, became grotesque in hindsight. The internet allowed no escape, No forgetting, no grace. For them, the world's obsession was a life sentence of shame. The truth is, the Watts case did not belong to the families anymore. It belonged to the world. It became a mirror of our digital age, a story we could not stop watching because it reflected the darkness lurking behind ordinary lives. And so millions sat at their screens, grieving for children they never met, judging a mistress they never knew, condemning a man they could not understand. The world watched, and in watching, it became part of the tragedy itself. Some lives vanish with death. Shanann's did not. Through the endless scroll of social media, she still breathes. Her voice still rings through videos. Her smile still fills the screen. Her children still laugh, frozen in clips where innocence feels eternal. Bella, singing softly about her daddy being her hero. Celeste, squealing with joy, clutching toys larger than her small arms could carry. These are no longer simple home videos. They are living ghosts, fragments of a life that ended violently, but refuses to disappear. The digital age does not allow the dead to rest. For Shanann, this means she is remembered not in silence, but in endless replay. Millions revisit her words, her movements, her joy. Every post becomes a shrine, every video a wound reopened. Friends and strangers alike find themselves staring at her eyes, knowing what she did not know, that time was running out, that her home was a stage of betrayal, that her marriage was already collapsing behind her back. To watch her now is unbearable. The ordinary becomes tragic. A simple smile at Chris in a video feels like a dagger because the viewer knows he was already gone in spirit. Every moment she spoke of hope becomes a prophecy betrayed. Her videos, once meant to inspire, now carry the weight of a requiem. And yet, they endure. Shanann's digital footprint has outlived her body, making her story eternal. Unlike generations past, where victims faded into photos tucked in boxes, Shanann exists in the cloud, her presence one click away. For her family, this is both comfort and torment. Comfort, because her daughter's laughter can still be heard. Torment, because that laughter will never be heard again in reality. Comfort, because her legacy remains alive. Torment, because strangers consume her memory as if it were entertainment. Her online life became evidence, dissected by investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives. But it also became something more profound, a legacy. She crafted her world with intention, sharing her struggles, her illnesses, her triumphs. In doing so, she unknowingly left behind a testimony, a record of a woman who fought for her family, who worked to project joy in the face of suffering, who refused to let illness or despair define her. Bella and Celeste live on too, not only in the memories of loved ones, but in images replayed across millions of screens. Their voices echo through the years, forever young, forever innocent, forever preserved. This is the bittersweet curse of digital immortality. The world never forgets, but the remembering is agony. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico became eternal not by choice, but by tragedy. They became living ghosts in an age where death is no longer an ending, but a loop of images and sounds we can never silence. The family Chris destroyed will never fade into history. They will remain here, in pixels and memory, haunting us every time we press play. Inside the steel silence of a Wisconsin prison, Chris Watts lives a life stripped bare. No family photographs. No laughter of children echoing down hallways. No wife's voice calling his name. Only cinder block walls, the rhythm of locked doors, and the hollow weight of what he has done. Here, in his cell, Chris became a man of shifting confessions. At first, he painted himself as overwhelmed, a victim of rage, a man pushed beyond reason. Later, he spoke of premeditation, of planning. His words changed with the seasons, like a prisoner rewriting his own history, searching for a version of himself he could tolerate. Religion filled the void. He clutched Bibles, spoke of forgiveness, called himself reborn. But his faith sat uneasily against the reality of his crimes. Each letter he wrote was stained with contradictions, remorse tangled with excuses, humility paired with blame. In one breath, he called himself damned. In another, he called himself saved. And always, her name returned. Nichol Kessinger, the mistress he once adored in secret, now transformed into a phantom he blamed. In prison conversations, he cast her as a Jezebel, a temptation that lured him into darkness. He spoke as though she were the spark that ignited the fire. Yet investigators never found evidence she planned the murders, never charged her with a crime. Still, Chris kept her shadow alive, dragging her into every retelling, as if sharing his guilt could somehow lighten the crushing weight of it. But prison does not erase the truth. Behind bars, Chris is not a father, not a husband, not even a lover. He is only a man who murdered his family, a man whose every attempt at reinvention collapses under the enormity of that fact. The prison walls do not forgive. They only echo. And in that echo lives the silence of Sean, Ann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, a silence Chris can never escape. Even after confessions, after courtrooms, after prison doors slammed shut, the Watts case remains full of silence. We know who is gone. We know who killed them. But we do not know why in a way that satisfies the human heart. Was it financial despair? Was it the lure of another woman? Was it years of quiet resentment building into catastrophe? Or was it something darker, something unreachable, the kind of evil that defies logic, that grows in ordinary men until it devours them? Nichol Kessinger's shadow still lingers. She insists she knew nothing, yet her presence was undeniable. Her name echoes through prison letters, online forums, endless speculation. Did she encourage him? Did she know more than she admitted? The law has spoken, but the questions remain, circling like vultures over a story that never finds peace. And what of Chris himself? He speaks of forgiveness, of faith, of rebirth. Yet each confession contradicts the last. Each retelling feels less like truth, more like performance. Is he a man who snapped, or a man who calculated? Was he broken by pressures, or born with a fracture the world could never see? We may never know. The answers lie locked in a mind that has forfeited the right to be trusted. What we do know is this: a mother's laughter was silenced, 2 children's futures stolen, an unborn life extinguished before it began. A family destroyed from within, leaving scars not only on relatives, but on an entire world that still searches for meaning in the meaningless. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of this case, that the truth remains unfinished and the haunting will never end. The Watts case is not only the story of a murder, it is the story of us. It forces us to confront the fragility of family, the dangers of silence, and the illusions we build to hide our pain. It shows how appearances can be polished until they shine, while beneath them cracks grow wide enough to swallow everything. Shanann's smile, Bella's song, Celeste's laughter, baby Nico's promise. They remind us of innocence, of love worth protecting, of what should never have been lost. Chris's betrayal reminds us of how easily trust can be shattered, how quickly a hidden life can destroy everything in its path. And Nichol's shadow, whether guilty of more than what the law has proven or not, lingers as a symbol of temptation, secrecy, and the unanswered questions that haunt us still. In the end, this is not just one family story. It is a mirror, a reflection of our digital age, our fragile relationships, our endless hunger to understand evil. The Watts family tragedy refuses to die because it belongs to us all now. A warning, a heartbreak, and a wound that will never fully heal.